as we've had up to now in museums, we like to have researchers coming in to be let loose in our collection, and recently Stephanie was in our collection, and it was great to see the outside expertise devoted to a collection, because I'm, as an ethnologist, very, very familiar with the artefacts and the ways of life native to my own place, but these things, such as those in the Scottish Fisheries Museum, which came into Shetland by dint of economics, imported baskets, willow baskets and cane baskets, we're less familiar with them, and it's great to see expertise devoted to it. But what I'm going to talk about now is solely things which are indigenous to technological problem here. Indigenous to Shetland. I'm going to turn the clock back, go before the era of market economics and before the era of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution never got to Shetland per se, got there by dint of imports, but not directly. Now, prior to that time, of course, we were very much a subsistence society rooted in dependence on our own natural resources. But really, in the 19th century, in the last dying gasps of that way of life, these roving Victorian authors who came to the islands, they saw such things. I didn't want to have a problem with this thing. So, yeah, yeah, I think so. They came to Shetland and they tended to dwell on that which they deemed to be of interest, and so they knew what to look for, and in turn further visitors knew what to look for because of what other people had looked for. And this is very much a tired old stereotype. If there's anyone here from Orkney, from the Hebrides as well as from Shetland, this is a familiar old standard. And so on. I could have shown you half an hour's worth of slides of woman with basket of peats whilst knitting and walking. And it's so tired, it's so stereotypical, it's not inaccurate. I'm not saying it didn't happen, it happened all the time, but is there one picture of a Shetlander mucking out a byre? No. That happened all the time. What we really need to do is to look at things in the economic context, and that's how we understand why all these huge different numbers of baskets were made at all. The model there, it's a schematic of a typical Shetland pre-19th century township. It's a familiar thing to anyone from northwest Europe. It's used in Iceland, Norway, Scotland, Ireland, lots of different places where you have an infield area inside a dike with arable lands, worked in Runrig, and worked communally, and the common grazing area out with that access to rush and to heather, other natural resources, and that's straightforward. But it's more interesting than that, because although that way of life in Shetland survived into the 18th century, and likewise it was known in the 8th century, there's a big difference between ourselves and our cultural affiliates, because up to the late 15th century we were part of Norway, and we were insulated from material change because of economic poverty. Scottish settlement in Shetland had a wholly deleterious effect on the economy, but because of that poverty, it meant that we had a greater reliance on our own natural resources, so that stimulated local tradition. Whereas looking at, for example, these other two pictures here, which are from Faroe, the islands to the north of Shetland, these are things which aren't really very Shetlandic in terms of some parts, but overall they look quite Shetlandic. The farmhouses there are similar in scale. The landscape isn't all that dissimilar, but you'll see how it has a grass roof and timber walling, and likewise the wooden pannier there, which equates to the Shetland kizzy, That's the Faroese Leipur. Now the Faroese Leipur, it's made from timber, of course, and that is the background to the whole story, is that whereas Shetland became, I suppose I could say it's a bit of a withered limb on the end of Britain, and we were having to depend ever more on our medieval traditions in the Faroe and in Iceland. They remain tied to the Scandinavian motherland and thereby access to timber imports. And so, although these things look just as indigenous to Faroe as straw things do to Shetland, I would maybe somewhat tendentiously argue that our straw items are maybe more truly indigenous to an island even than these Faroese items are to their islands. So let's have a look now at the constituent materials. Well, the primary one, of course, is straw. I won't dwell much on terminology and language here, but again, there's an interesting background to it all here, because we've got in Shetland a Scandinavian tradition, and the terms which are used and were used are primarily Scandinavian terms, but they're used in Shetland in our own now extinct language. We have haver, which is straw, simmons, which is rope, hjogs, which are the bunches of straw in a basket, the fasgert, which is the loop around the top, the fettle, which is the strap, and so on ad nauseum. These are all Scandinavian terms. So too with the name of the product there. And that's basically used for anything requiring bulk. So it's used in basketry and it's used in thatching. Rush, common rush or squat rush, both. It was a very commonly used rope, and as we had at the beginning, there is a degree of adaptability within even a small place like Shetland, depending on the natural resources available. So, for example, most of Shetland has a marshland quite nearby, and this was a preferred rope for preferred material for rope making, such as in basketry, or in that top basket there, which is called the river keshi, which is used for carrying large blocks of turf, so you didn't need keshi, or for the top left item there, which is a hobble used on sheep's ankles. It's not like jumping over a dike. These are all things where a nice, strong, smooth rope is used, and straw wouldn't be so robust. But if you didn't have a marshland nearby, such as in perhaps the southern part of Shetland, you had to use something else. But that's a common rope type, this rush. Docks, of course, are of interest. And here it's quite interesting that the common term in Shetland was a synonym, or a corruption, you could say, of the English word dock. If there ever was, and there would have been, a Scandinavian word for docks in Shetland that's long forgotten. The remnants of the language were recorded in the late 19th century, but no name for docks was recorded. But what was commonly used was just a corruption of the English word dock, and it's used in baskets for the land, such as the lower picture there. He's carrying peats there, and for the sea, the chap at the top there who's baiting haddock lines. It's used in fishery too. And there is today in Shetland, because this tradition is dead, there's a bit of a misunderstanding that if it's made from straw, it's a kishi. If it's made from docks, it's a buddy. That's not so. The name is descriptive of the use, not of the material. So a kishi can be made of straw or docks, and a buddy can be made of straw or docks. It's entirely due to resource availability. Maram, it's very locally distributed. As you'll see again, it has a non-Scandinavian name. I've put it in parentheses there to throw up that fact. It's a Scottish term. It isn't a Shetland term per se. It's a thing commonly used in southern Shetland, Dunrosmus parish, and although large areas of sand in Shetland where maram grows aren't very common, there are areas in some of the northern islands, but there isn't such a tradition of using maram, and that's because I think in the 19th century it was purposefully transported there to help consolidate eroding sand as part of landowners' land improvement policies. So there you can see there's a brush, ball of rope, and fish basket. Heather. Now the name Ling was used in Shetland because of the fact that it derived from an Old Norse root. The name Ling is used in English too, but the name had been used in Shetland since medieval times, so you can regard it as a Scandinavian term there too. Basketry is a well enough known use of it, certainly in Shetland, likewise in Orkney. There's a little bait cuddy there, but a forgotten use of it, and an extremely important use of it, was in thatching. That picture there is the only picture which survives showing heather thatching rope in use. Although we do have specimens in the museum, and that ball there is an example of it, where bits have been salvaged when some of these roofs were still in existence in the 1960s and they were caving in, and some smart thinking people thought to salvage bits from old roofs. And a few words now about technique. I hardly need to talk to a group of basket makers about technique. There's nothing revelatory here, I'm sure, but there's twisting, of course, which is a method of making the rope itself. Ewan is busy there, twisting as we go. And there you see straw, which is the main type that's used for any rough and ready agricultural task, so securing a haystack, anything like that. Marram is the close-up picture there, and heather at the top. And of the body of an item itself, there's two methods of manufacture. One is weaving, and that's perhaps maybe the more picturesque of the two. It's the one which maybe has attracted most interest in contemporary basket students and crafts people recreating the technique. You'll see there from the top right picture in straw how it's used, and to the left of it there's another basket in dock, and it just consists of bunches of individual strands, more of straw obviously and fewer of dock, secured by passing two continuous strands, just as in stitching boot soles together. And you'll see also from the top right picture there how to bring the width on an item, you add in additional bunches as you go. It's primarily done at the ends of a basket, but also in the sides too if you're seeking to flare out. And the other of the two methods, of course, is colling. And these are just made in a spiral there. The most common type was a thing which we called a toig, and a toig was a small basket used for clews of yarn, say for keeping eggs or something you wanted to keep clean in house. Less common, I'd say, until recent years, was the peat basket, and that's because there was a bit of an arts and crafts, I wouldn't say a revival, more like an attempt to stop the craft from dying in the mid-20th century, and it was a sort of picturesque but still useful way of keeping a tradition going. So lots of people bought these things from the few makers in the 1950s and 60s who could still make such things. The top one there is made from docks. We've had a little of that one already. And now on to some of the individual tasks to which these different techniques were put to. Well, a typical one was winnowing corn. In this case it's oats that he's winnowing there, so that's the grain having been thrashed. The chaff is blown off by dropping it onto a mat, and the wind blows away the chaff, and you need to land on something to stop landing amongst grime and feathers and grass and any other detritus around the barn door. And you can see how it's made there. It's just several bunches of straw secured together by lashing. And your winnowing mat, flacky as it was called, could only be as long as the longest two bunches of straw put end to end. Haymaking was another common way in which your 19th century visitor would have seen and should have taken more photos of bass tree in use. There aren't many pictures. The left picture is a 19th century one. Again, I suspect that these things made it into the photographic record because it was a bit more picturesque because there's horses involved. But just as many burdens of hay were carried on the back in this type of pannier called a meshi, just by carrying it on a human's back. But there's next to no pictures of that. But there's quite a few pictures of hay from the later period, 20th century, when it was dying out at an alarming rate, and some people did think to belatedly take pictures of it. Various uses in fisheries here, and I've just restricted it to 2 slides just to give you a taster. This first one here shows shore fishery, and it breaks into 2 types. There's fishing with a rod and then fishing with a big bag net, so it's on an iron hoop. And that type of fishing with the big bag net, a pock as it was known, that's what's happening in the painting there. And the reason that these little bait containers were made, we've seen them in pictures and we've mentioned them, but not maybe considered why they were used. These bait containers were used with limpets because the method of attracting the fish involved parboiling limpets and then chewing them and then spitting them out onto the water, and then the oily slick on top of the water, that's what attracted your fish. Immature coal fish, so they're quite small, maybe say 6 inches long, 8 inches long, something like that. And your bait container, such as the one in the lower right there, which is made from heather, but they were also made from straw as well. They were usually made quite open, such that any water and perhaps saliva too could dribble through the bottom, so that you had the thing ready for use. And the fisher would take with them also a basket to take the fish back home, because you could net all day long if you wanted to, because in those days there was a superabundance of fish around their coasts. And the buddy, which was the fish basket, was taken. So the top right one there is a buddy. That one's made from straw, and they tended to be just like the more familiar keshi, except somewhat smaller and somewhat less flared out. And there's the other fishery slide there. That one is for boat fishery. There's no real material difference in the buddy used at sea. It would really only be in the context of its use that you might tell that this one tended to be used more in a boat or that one more at land. Although that particular one in the photo there I included because it does show a constructional specialization for boat use, because this one hasn't had any of these hyogs, these bunches, added into the ends of the basket, so that the overall thing is quite flat. And the reason for that is that the fishermen can use it as a cushion to sit on whilst rowing. So onto the fishing grounds they sit on this thing to row out, because it's going to be quite hard going when you're rowing some tens of miles out to sea sometimes in larger boats. And you can see one of the fishermen there on the left there, he's actually sitting on a buddy on the rock there. And at land we've got the collection of seabirds' eggs. There wasn't really a seabird egg collecting or bird collecting keshi as such, but because these things were made all the time, every year, every winter time, these things were made in many, many numbers in every home. People would make small ones and big ones, and if the one that they tended to take with them around the cliffs had come a bit careworn, another one would be made. But it would be wrong to say that one was made only to collect seabirds' eggs in. It would just be made to be a small one and a big one, and that particular one was used latterly to collect seabirds' eggs. The item at the top there, that was a hovey, and a hovey was a type of fish trap. And lots of places in Shetland, particularly in the west, where there's larger streams leading up to lochs, so this is a loch here, were very good for sea trout. And you can see that there's two, just It doesn't have a pointer on it, but you can see this a rumble heap of stones on the left there, and also one in mid-distance. These are settings for a hervey, so these are stone dikes which bisect a stream or a narrow loch, and this fish trap made from docks is placed in the intervening gap, and the fish come upstream and they're trapped into the net, and then once you collect your fish you just take the net away again. Such was the number of the fish that they didn't need to leave them for very long. The mouth of the thing there, it's flat and it's heavy because it's an oak batten in the bottom, so it's a big heavy chunk of wood anyway, and then a couple of rocks held it secure in the stream bed. I suppose the most common use of all is the most general use in basketry, and that's carrying things. And carrying things is something that occurs in several parts buried away in our photo collection. If you look just initially for Kishi in the database, then you're thrown up with many women carrying a basket of peats while knitting. But look beyond that, and you will find others. These are just some typical ones, just to give a taster of what it's used for. It's used when sowing grain, and the woman in the large picture there, she's washing clothes, or she's rinsing clothes which has been washed outdoors in a loch there. So it's just anything that involved carrying from A to B. Probably the most interesting aspect for our group here, because it spawned so many individual artifact types, is the harvesting of peat, because by its nature it tends to be on the moorlands and quite far from home, and so there's then the challenge of how to get it home. Well, if your home is nearby, in some cases people could carry it just in a basket directly to home. So in some of the islands, again in the north of Shetland, that was done. In other places, such as in the west or in the southwest, there were places where the peat areas were on uninhabited islands or across bays, so people had to take it by boat. And again, your basket needed to be used in the transferal from the peat bag to the boat, and from the boat to the home. Further away again, you'd have to take it by sled or cart, so that doesn't involve a basket other than a kizhi, but usually, if it's far from home, the cart isn't much use because the terrain is quite difficult, so then you've got to take it by pack saddle. And then if by pack saddle, sometimes the peat is quite fibrous and you can get it in big enough chunks that you can take it, such as in the small one on the right there. It's just taken directly in a meishi, one of these big nets you saw for carrying hay, directly on the pack saddle without any other artifact involved. But in most instances, if your peat is quite far away and you do need to take it by pack saddle, you do also need to take it in a kizhi, the general purpose basket, which is then carried in a meishi, this mesh rope thing on the pack saddle. So that's two artifacts used there. But whilst all this is going on, under the pack saddle, the big picture at the top there, you've got straw mat, which is used to protect the horse's back, because it's quite a heavy load, this hard wooden saddle and these two panniers of peat. So there's a lot of basketry artifacts there used just solely in the vein of transportation of peat. So it's a very artifact heavy process, which is good for curators. And in building, it's maybe a little bit ancillary to basketry, but I think it might be of interest to us. The use in building in roofing, straw techniques. Primarily it's oat straw used in roofing, although reed grass was used too, where available. And the roping of the thatch itself, heather if available, because it was very, very long wearing, and the roofing technique itself, it looks Scottish or Western British. It looks like it could be in Ireland, maybe. It could be in the Hebrides, possibly. Orkney, very like Orkney. Could be the Highlands. But really, it's a remnant from our Scandinavian past, which was somewhat tempered by Scottish culture, because most of the parts of the terminology of the roof, again, were Scandinavian terms, but the actual constituent materials didn't change. Also in building, these don't survive today, so I've had to find two indicative slides to give you an idea of things. Straw was used to make partitions and doors in houses, but although this was done in Shetland, again, because we were split off from the Norwegian heartland, we had to depend ever more on our natural resources, so the techniques which were already in use in making baskets and winnowing mats were readily transferable to make larger blocks of basketry, such as in doors and partitions. Although all that was done, what happened was, from the 18th century onwards, our economy was invigorated by landlords building commercial fisheries, and this of course means that in an invigorated economy you have imports, and we eventually do benefit from imported timber again after some hundreds of years gap, but this time it comes from Britain, it doesn't come from Norway. But rapidly timber ousts straw in constructional use. But it is known that it was done, and it was done in these vertical bunches but incorporating wooden stiffeners. With whole partitions and doors too. The picture on the left there, it isn't Shetland, it's a picture from Ulster, but you can just see a somewhat dilapidated door on wooden battens to the right of the doorway there. And general containers for the home. We've mentioned the Tait already for balls of yarn and such like, the peat basket, and then this somewhat more specialised salt cuddy. And the reason that it's so shaped is that to stop the salt, which was used in food preparation, becoming coagulated, because old-fashioned homes were quite damp, it needed to be kept as near the hearth as possible. And in a home with a central hearth where there's no chimney, it's very easy for large gobbets of soup to fall down and make its way into the salt. So the thing is curved inward at the top, just leaving a little aperture where a person can push her hand in to get out what salt is required. And just to finish off with the various uses of the straw, there's so many, I had to restrict my enthusiasm here, curb my enthusiasm. There's the use in brushes. These in the little grain mill here are made from straw. And it's quite interesting that in times bygone in Shetland, just as in the Outer Hebrides, the grain hopper used to be made from straw. But in Shetland, once timber importation picked up again in the 18th century, and more so the 19th century, we were able to oust straw in favour of wood in grain hoppers. And in the left there, just as all vacuum cleaners are hoovers, all straw-backed chairs are Orkney chairs. Oh no, they're not. There's a Shetland chair. The biggest difference is that in Shetland, this never made it into the commercial mode, commercial aspect. In Shetland, these things were only ever done on a subsistence scale. They were done by the farmers themselves for their own use. And once they ceased needing to do it, they didn't do it. Whereas in Orkney, it became a craft product, and it was made professionally and sold to customers. And this, of course, held and holds the product in esteem, whereas in Shetland it was just another piece of tradition which just fell off the end of the conveyor belt, and that's the only one that survives. That was it. And there's one photograph, contemporary photograph, showing one in use. As far as costume, complete costume from straw. And this again is a relic from our medieval past. This is a pre-Christian tradition, which believe it or not, it survived in Shetland up to about 1900 when that picture was taken. And this masquerade costume, it has a similarity to Faroese traditions, the Faroese grilla, and in terms of the morphology of the costume, it's closest to the straw boys of Northwest Ireland. So you can see that even in areas of the similar culture, Faroe and Ireland and Shetland, you can have quite similar constructions, because given the same natural resources and the same economic difficulties, you may well end up with a similar product. And these costumes were only worn in the winter time, around about Hallowmas, Candlemas, that time, and it involved youngsters going in disguise from house to house, playing out the parts of mythological beings, these skeptlers as they were called, led by the head skeppler called the Scoodler, and they came in disguise and they passed around the sheepskin bag, and you had to put gifts of, latterly it was food, but originally it was meat, into the bag. And a verse was said in riddle, and they danced a circular, like a ring dance on the floor, and they had wooden staves which they wrapped on the floor. And I'm going to finish off with why did it all die? Because it all seems picturesque and a thing that's alive and kicking today. Well, our tradition survives maybe in a fairly attenuated form, and this tradition didn't die, thankfully, because of primarily one person, Lowry Copeland, who we've heard a little bit about already and we'll be hearing a little bit more about, and his night class, which ran from the 1970s up to his death a few years ago, and some people in Shetland, myself included, went to the class, and fortunately we have the finest Shetland basket maker, sans parallel, Ewan, here, who learned the craft at that night class. So I know that within ethnologists there are a little bit of a semantic debate about can a tradition be as genuine if it dies out even just for 10 years and then it's recreated again. Well, in this case it is a continuous tradition, it hasn't died out. But the reason it nearly died out by many little cuts can be seen in this picture here. It's imports, really. Coir rope, for one thing, but it's quite adaptable, the tradition there. You can throw away heather rope and you can incorporate the coir rope, but essentially that looks like that 19th century picture, so that's okay. We can take on that import. And to a degree we can do it there too. So in coil basketry, we don't have to twist little maram rope, we can make it a cotton string, but it looks quite similar. And in the peat flitting, mesh is still being used, but she was, can you go back one minute? Yeah, she's using meshes, the baskets, in the same way, but rather than using the straw pannier within, she's using Hessian fertilizer bags. So again, it's, you could arguably say that the tradition is limping on there just, but when it comes to more strident imports, these are the things which knocked out so many parts of our tradition and just stomped on it and killed it off very dramatically. So in the case of winnowing, what people latterly used as winnowing mats were old boat sails, sheets of linoleum, and people no longer needed to make these flackies out of straw. In the case of the hovey, which was the net, the trapping net, sea trout net, docks were no longer used, and imported cotton herring nets on galvanized barrel hooks. So you could say it's still a hovey in the sense of the name is the same, but it really isn't the same. And in the case of peat transportation, well, pack saddle equipment was killed at the thrust with the growth of road transport, and with road transport, flitting by lorry was available to all and sundry. And other imports such as, say, coal tar, that does away with roof thatch, imported brushes. That does away with straw brushes. And in the 1890 painting there, you can see these people are using what's called a Southport boat basket, which is a northern English type of basket. And these were, again, a craft product, almost like the Orkney chair, where you have a cottage craft which is made commercially, and with the booming economy that Britain is in those days, rail transport and advertising and the shopkeeping economy of the kingdom, means that anyone, even in faraway Shetland, wherever that might be, we have these baskets too, and thereby all these things like toigs, they cease getting used. And I think maybe the most interesting one of them all is the cane basket. That great misnomer, the willow basket. People in Shetland, just like anywhere else, talk about willow kishies and willow biddies, but I think I've maybe seen one made from willow. 99.9% of them are made from cane. And just like with the kishie and the biddy, it's descriptive of use, so too with these. The top picture shows ones made for land use. These people are harvesting potatoes. And the bottom picture shows a chap with a somewhat taller version, which is wide at the bottom and narrow at the top. That's because this one's for fish. Now the name's the same. It's called a kishie, called a biddy, but really is it the lineal descendant of the Shetland indigenous one? It's debatable. It's a moot point. It's something that will maybe never fully settle. But it's interesting about the construction of them. You can see there's a wooden form, and this is a thing which didn't exist in Shetland before. People had to devise it. So they're taking an idea of what a basket should look like, taking a new material which they've never had to deal with before, and finding a new answer. So it's an independent Shetland idea, certainly, but I wouldn't say that it was as indigenous as a kishie was, because the material's an import, so it depends on outside influence. I will mention that lower picture there, sorry. This is my second last slide, believe me. The lower picture there again shows a new apparatus which again islanders were able to devise themselves because of this new challenge they'd come up with and the new answer. Rather than transport peats by pack saddle, they devised this contraption with overhead wires to pull down baskets of peat in these cane kishies direct to lower township level, but it depends again on imported wire and all that paraphernalia. So with the last picture there, I'll just say that hopefully, having kind of seen how all these things nestle together in a subsistence community, in a pre-industrial revolution community, you can maybe think a little bit beyond how the things were made and also consider why they were made. And I have to admit, there's no sense in raging against the dying of the light. This way of life, it isn't going to be coming back, and we can't in Shetland get people to be interested in, let alone make, a hovey from docks. But I think it's our task to maybe to educate people and to make them realise that there's more to, or there was more to basketry than corny old Victorian standards such as the one on the lower left there. That's me.